Mark Twain once said, "It's not the things in the Bible that I don't understand that really trouble me. It's all the things in the Bible that I do understand. That's what really troubles me." There are a significant number of people who, when they read it, are just troubled by what they find. And the Bible, which was meant to draw people to God, actually becomes a barrier for many people. It's not a lack of faith that leads us to wrestle with the Bible. It's because we have faith that when we find something that seems inconsistent with the character of God, that we wrestle with that. I hope when people are done reading this book that they have an appreciation for the historical context, the culture of Scripture, how the Bible was put together, who wrote it, why they wrote it, and then how to make sense of its troubling passages so that they can read the Bible and they can hear God speaking through it.
All right, so today we're going to continue on our series that we started last week. Last week, Pastor Ryan introduced the series, Making Sense of the Bible. He talked about the Hebrew Scriptures. So we're drawing a lot of this series from a book written by Adam Hamilton, who's a Methodist pastor in Kansas City. He wrote this book called Making Sense of the Bible. So as we continue today, we're going to be talking about the New Testament, making sense of the New Testament. So first, we're going to play a game as we're starting. Before I show the slide, I'm going to name a quote of a movie, and I want you guys to try to guess what movie this is from. Fight, and you may die. Run, and you'll live, at least a while. And dying in your beds many years from now, will you be willing to trade all the days from this day to that for one chance, just one chance to come back here and tell our enemies that they may take our lives, but they will never take our freedom? Braveheart. So I got a picture here of Braveheart. Mel Gibson, of course, holding his mighty sword. Did you know, interesting fact, Braveheart turned 20 this year, which I thought, I'm like, oh, I didn't realize that until I was looking for this picture. I'm like, 1995, wow. So I grew up, and Braveheart really influenced my late childhood, probably earlier than it should have, in early adulthood. But I bring up this image because for many people, the Bible has actually been used much like a sword. So a sword is a weapon that's designed to cause and inflict pain and to kill. And for many people in our culture, the Bible has been used in very similar ways. It's been used to inflict pain and to cause destruction on people's lives. And maybe in many of us here, we've seen that personally in our own lives as well. So we're going to be wrestling through some of that. Obviously, the Old Testament has a lot, as Molly shared, it's a lot of violence, a lot of things there that we struggle with. It was written a long time ago. But also, that's true of the New Testament as well. So a couple obvious things that we all are pretty aware of, but I'm going to share a couple passages. The first one is in 1 Timothy 2, verses 12 and 13. It says this, "I permit no woman to teach or to have authority over a man. She is to keep silent. For Adam was formed first, then Eve. And Adam was not deceived, but the woman was deceived and became a transgressor." So I'm going to go out on a limb here. I'm going to say that this is not a flagship verse for feminists, all right? This verse, along with others, has been used throughout history to marginalize women. In fact, throughout church history, there's been the majority of leadership and pastors and priests have been men. All right? And people have been drawing actually not from the Old Testament, but from the New Testament and using this. And that's still going on today. In fact, there's certain denominations and churches that will not allow women in leadership. Another one, slavery. And there's just a couple passages I'm pulling from here. In Ephesians, it says, "Slaves, obey your earthly masters with fear and trembling." Another one in Titus says, "Tell slaves to be submissive to their masters and to give satisfaction in every respect." And so for hundreds of years, the Bible has been used to condone slavery. In fact, there's nothing directly that you can read in the Bible that is against or anti-slavery. Anything that addresses it is all addressing slaves, obey your masters. Masters, treat your slaves right. And so for years and years in this country as well, blood has been shed, drawing from the New Testament to promote and condone slavery. And there's true of other things going on. Sexual orientation is another big topic now. There's other issues, but a lot of these issues are not just Old Testament issues. They're there in the New Testament. So today, how do we, as 21st century people, make sense of the New Testament? We're going to get into a lot of information. I'm going to geek out a little bit. I hope that's okay. So get your thinking caps on. We're going to jump in. The first slide here I have a little bit of background information about the New Testament. We're going to compare the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament to the Christian Bible and the New Testament. There's a slide, side-by-side comparison, since we learned about the Hebrew Bible last week. So the first thing you notice, obviously, is the amount of verses in the Hebrew Bible compared to the Christian Bible. The second thing is the years. So the Hebrew Bible spans about a 1,000-year period, so much more diverse, different cultures. The New Testament, or the Christian Bible, is only about a 50-year period of time. Language, most of the Old Testament was written in Hebrew. Most of the New Testament was written in Greek. And we're going to talk about that in a little bit. 39 books in the Old Testament, 27 books in the New Testament. So for the Protestant Bible, there's about a fourth of the Bible is the Old Testament, or what many call the Hebrew Bible. And the New Testament is three-fourths of the Bible is the Old Testament, and a fourth of the Bible is the New Testament. So there's the biggest chunk is the Old Testament. And then, it was written in Greek. So I have a slide here that shows us just an example of what Greek is like. Taken from John 1:1, Greek, unlike Hebrew, is more similar to English in that it's read from left to right. So this is a passage that talks about, in the beginning was the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And you can even see on that top line there, logos, which looks very similar to what we would write as logos. It's, I think, the fifth word over there, logos. So it's important for us to remember that the Bible, the New Testament, was written down in Greek for a few reasons. The first is that Jesus primarily, and most scholars believe that Jesus spoke Aramaic. He might have spoke some Greek as well, but primarily spoke Aramaic, which means that for some people, when we read the words of Jesus, and some people take them literal, like these are the exact things Jesus said. First of all, Jesus spoke Aramaic. Then it was written down years later in Greek. And then it was translated into English. All right, so that's helpful for us to remember. Two, the authors, another thing, sorry, I'm going to skip that one. Copies of the writings were passed down. So what we have now, I was raised in a tradition that viewed the Bible as inerrant. All right, some of you might be familiar with that. That just basically means that it was a view that the Bible is perfect, that it's flawless. And so I was wrestling through this in Bible school, actually. And what I began to see, it was what sounded like a circular argument to me, and that the Bible is flawless. But then I was made aware from my professors that what they have are multiple manuscripts that they're drawing from. They're ancient, but they're drawing from multiple manuscripts, scholars are. And these manuscripts don't all align perfectly. Now, they share a lot of similarities, so it's not like this big conspiracy theory, but it's not perfect either. And scholars are trying to draw from these and say, okay, what was most likely in the original? Or how do we combine these to write most likely what was there in the original? And they have rules that they follow, some of them being what was the shortest. So if there's some that are longer, usually people add on after, they don't subtract. And so they have some guidelines that they use. But what I found interesting was then people who are more educated that still hold to an inerrant view of the Bible will say, well, no, the Bible isn't inerrant how we have it. It's inerrant in its original autographs, which what that means is when Paul was sitting down and writing Romans, the letter to Romans, that actual letter that he wrote then was inerrant. And then my professors proceeded to tell me that we don't have any of those original autographs. What we have is copies of copies of copies of copies. And so, to me, the whole thing just did not make sense. So you're telling me to believe that the Bible is perfect. Well, not the Bible that we have now. The Bible that we could have had or was around someday was perfect. And so what we have is pretty close to perfect. Which, okay. I mean, it's pretty close to perfect, but what part of it isn't perfect then? And it just seems like, why do we need to have this argument? Why do we need to hold on to this perfect Bible when it seems like God was somehow working through humanity, imperfect people? Who's to say that God can't still inspire through imperfect people translating it till we get our Bible? And so my fear is that for some people, holding to a perfect Bible is propping the Bible up too high. In a sense, if you've ever gone to a movie and you've heard somebody say, this movie is the best movie ever, it's my favorite movie, and then you go and you watch it, and you have that feeling of you're so let down afterwards. Why was I so disappointed? and you're trying to analyze it in your head, like, oh, that was a good movie. Why didn't I like it? And then you remember the conversation someone had, oh, they said it was like the bomb, the best movie ever. And then I go, and I have such high expectations, and I'm just let down. And so for many people, I fear that when we prop the Bible up too high and that it's perfect, that people are let down when we start reading and we start seeing some inconsistencies. Instead of realizing, hey, God can still inspire and work through those. Because God still does today, right? We're imperfect people. We don't have a perfect worldview. Imagine 2,000 years from now, right? If people are looking at our writings and the way we see things, do you think there's going to be some changes that might happen in 2,000 years? Probably. They'll look at us and be like, man, those ancient people that just did not get it, right? And so that's some things in some ways that we can take to help us make sense of the Bible, realizing it's not perfect, and that's okay. God works through imperfection, and God can still work through us as imperfect people too. The next slide I have talks about the canonical order of Scripture. And that just basically means this is the order of the New Testament that we find in our Protestant Bibles as it appears. So the New Testament starts with Matthew and ends with Revelation. All right? So the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are the first books that we have. And then we have Acts. Acts is a part 2 of Luke. So the author who wrote Luke as part 1, and then Acts as part 2. Same author there. Then we go on and we have the letters from Paul. And those can be separated. We're going to talk about those a little bit more in depth here in a second. But we have letters from Paul. The first set are letters from Paul that Paul wrote to churches or geographic areas. And there's 9 of those: Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, 1st Thessalonians, 2nd Thessalonians. So there's 9 of those. And the order that we have them written in our Bible are from longest to shortest. So there's a reason why they're ordered that way. Not because they were written that way, but Romans is longest, and then 2nd Thessalonians is shortest. All right, lots of information. You guys still with me? All right. Next, we have Paul's letters to individuals. And there's 4 of those: 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, Titus, and Philemon. And these are the letters, again, that Paul wrote, geared towards specific people, but that were also meant to be read aloud to others. Right? And again, they're in order longest to shortest of that group. Meaning 1 Timothy is the longest, and then Philemon is the shortest. Then we have Hebrews. Scholars debate. It's written by an anonymous author. Next, we have letters by others. And so there's 7 of those letters. There's James, 1 Peter, 2 Peter, 1 John, 2 John, 3 John, and Jude. Those letters were named after the people that we believe wrote those. So unlike Paul, we don't have a 1 Paul, 2 Paul, 3 Paul, right? All of Paul's letters are named for the people or the places that were meant. These letters were written for their authors. Helps us understand. Finally, we get to Revelation. So if you've ever read through Revelation and thought, this is so bizarre and confusing, and I don't have a clue what the heck is going on, you are not alone, all right? And that is because Revelation is very distinct. Revelation is written in what is called apocalyptic literature. It's very foreign to anything we have today. Apocalyptic literature is very symbolic, and it's often also very violent. So when you're reading about dragons and beasts and all this other stuff, just know it was a specific genre of literature that the first century understood. It's symbolic. Bringing this to the 21st century, an analogy could be like an analogy I could make to you would be to say within the next year, we are going to see a great battle between the donkey and the elephant, right? And you guys know exactly what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about a literal donkey and a literal elephant, right? It's code. It's kind of cartoon. And that's what we get from a lot of Revelation. Only we have no idea a lot of what John, who is probably the author, is trying to get at there. And actually, I think, my personal view, is that Revelation is one of the most misunderstood and misinterpreted books of the Bible. So if you have a skepticism when people start naming the end of the world and claiming who is the Antichrist, is the Obama the Antichrist, is Hillary the Antichrist, is so-and-so country the Antichrist, and there's a certain skepticism you have, I think that's healthy. I think we should have that. It's people taking from Scripture, usually not understanding what it was meant for and applying it and miscuing it. All right, does that make sense? So let's talk a little bit about the letters of Paul. You guys still with me? Lots of information here. So next, we're going to talk, is that what I have next? Okay, some dates. There we go. Some dates that help us better understand the New Testament. So Jesus lived, he was probably born in about 4 BC. So our calendars are a few years off, right? And that's okay. He died or was killed around 29 or 30 CE. Paul's letters were some of the first letters written. And he began writing probably in about 50-ish. Some dated a little earlier, but from 50 to 65 CE. And then the Gospels were written after that. So many people, I think, just assume because the order that they're in the Bible, that the Gospels were written first. It makes sense to put them there because you want to hear the story of Jesus before you hear about the story after Jesus, right? So how the New Testament began to become written. Paul was a Jew, a Jewish Pharisee, and he was sent out to persecute and sort of quench this new movement that was going on that became known as Christianity. And about 35 CE, a few years after the death of Jesus, we read that he had this mighty conversion experience. And then years later, he felt this call, this desire to take what people were calling the gospel or this good news outside of the Jewish people into more Gentile regions. So he began to travel. He would go to a place, let's take Ephesus, and he would begin to try to more or less plant a church, but raise up leaders, develop, teach. What does it mean to be a Christian? What did Jesus teach? How did Jesus live? So he would go and raise up some leaders. And then he would either get run out of town or he would feel called to go to another place. All right, you guys, you're sort of solid. You got a good grasp. And I want to go to another place, Thessalonica or wherever. And I want to plant another church and raise up more leaders. And he would do that. And then he would go to another place. And then sometimes what would happen is a messenger would come from that first place and say, hey, Paul, by the way, we're struggling with this issue. What do you say? And Paul would write a letter, and he would send it back to that church. And then maybe he would go somewhere else and say, oh, I forgot to inform them about this issue. And so he would write a letter to a specific church and then send it back there. What eventually started to happen is other groups said, hey, that letter that Paul wrote you, we want to know more about that. We're still interested. This is a new movement. People are trying to make sense of it. So what did Paul tell you? And they would go and copy the letter and begin to copy it and write it and bring it back. And then copies begin to circulate. Does that make sense? So these letters are almost like chainmail, right? That begin to happen, which makes sense. People want to know, what did Paul say to you? How did Paul address you? How does Paul addressing us? What can we learn that you have and that you learn? So Paul's letters, and I have a slide for this, 13 have been traditionally attributed to Paul. Now, some people don't know this or are unaware that there's some that are disputed, meaning some letters that people don't think Paul actually wrote. So first, let's talk about the undisputed letters. And I have them listed here, and I don't need to read them. And I put the rough dates that scholars give, roughly when they think Paul was writing those. And then next to that column, we have the undisputed letters. These are letters that people or scholars aren't sure, the disputed letters. These are the letters that scholars aren't sure, and they debate. Some scholars think, yeah, Paul may have wrote them. Some scholars say, oh, Paul didn't write them, and they have reasons why. So I put the dates next to those as under the disputed letters on the dates that the scholars that believe that they are disputed would have dated them. Now this is interesting because Paul was killed 65 CE. Which means that these letters, if they weren't written by Paul, were written after Paul. So for some of us, we think of, oh, there's disputed letters. What does that mean? Again, we kind of go down this, trickery, or people trying to deceive us. We can't trust the Bible. If Paul was dead in the first century and somebody was writing a letter in Paul's name, people that would have received that letter would have known it's not from Paul. It's written in Paul's name. It's called pseudographic. But it was meant to carry the power of Paul. It was meant to say, if Paul was here, this is probably what Paul would have wrote and sent there. And that's all assuming that it wasn't Paul that wrote them. Does that make sense? And so we have nothing to fear. It's not that people are out there trying to deceive us, but some of them may have not been written by Paul, and that's okay. It's part of Scripture. God's working through it. And if you remember when I first read about women in leadership, that was taken from 2 Timothy, that falls under the disputed letters. In fact, I took a New Testament class in seminary, and my professor would probably say that most of those letters were not written by Paul. And Paul had a very high view of women, actually. And so a lot of it is attributed to Paul that maybe he did not have, or maybe he did not even write. So something for us to keep aware of while we're trying to read through the New Testament. So let's talk about the Gospels for a second. The Gospels, there's 4 of them. Kind of important when we're talking about the New Testament or the Bible in general, right? So there's 4 Gospels. They are under ancient biographies. Ancient biographies are not like our modern biographies. When somebody writes a biography today, they're trying to get the complete, perfect picture from beginning to end, all the dates exact, filed accordingly. Ancient biographies were not so. And here's a few things that are true of that genre of literature, and they apply to the Gospels, I think, as well. So in ancient biographies, little attention is often given to the chronology of events. So when we read the Gospels, they don't always align chronologically. But that's okay because it's ancient biography. They weren't focused on that. Emphasis is given to the person's character and their defining traits. It's usually about a person and about their character and their traits. Little attention is often given to historical data. Consistent focus on the person's philosophy of life. So who was that person? What was their core, their philosophy of life? And then out of that came these stories that exemplify that philosophy. And then interestingly enough, there's a strong interest in the person's death as consistent with the philosophy of life. Right? So we're reading ancient biographies, which are different than our modern biographies, which revolve around the person of Jesus. What was Jesus' philosophy of life? What did he teach? What did he live? Next here, I have a slide that shows a little bit what scholars view, or how scholars interpret the writings of the New Testament. And some call this a 2-source theory, or it can be called a 4-source theory. You guys still with me? A lot of information. I'm kind of geeking out, and I hope people are following along. So, first of all, before we get confused and lost in this, let's start in Mark. It's the second box to the left. So most scholars believe Mark was written first, around 70. Mark was the first gospel written. So we start with that box. And if you notice, there's 2 lines and arrows that journey from Mark to Luke and Matthew. Most scholars believe that the author of Luke and the author of Matthew had Mark, a manuscript of Mark, before them. In fact, 90% of Mark can be found also in Matthew. And so they're very identical there. And then scholars are seeing that there's also a group overlap between Luke and Matthew that is not found in Mark. So they must have had something else that they were sharing, another source, and it's called the Q source. It's hypothetical. They're trying to figure this out. They must have had some other document there that they were both drawing from. And as you can follow along the lines there, go from the Q source to Luke and to Matthew. Because Matthew and Luke share things that aren't found in Mark. And then scholars realize there's things in there that neither one of them share. So there's more materials that they're drawing from. So on the far left, you have L, and on the far right, you have M. It's L material and M material. And that's sort of a conglomeration of probably oral tradition and some writings or teachings that they're drawing from. It's important and helpful for us to know there's 4 Gospels. They don't align perfectly. They weren't intended to align perfectly. Each Gospel was written by a different person to emphasize different traits. And for example, the Gospel of Matthew was written, many think, to a primarily Jewish audience. And so he's drawing a lot more from the Old Testament, which makes sense. Because if you're going to appeal to a Jewish audience and talk about Jesus, you're going to draw from their scriptures more heavily. Does that make sense? So a few things. Now, enough information. A few points that we can take from all of this. Most of the New Testament was written to give specific instructions to specific people. Right? Second thing, when we read much of the New Testament, we are reading someone else's mail. It wasn't written for me. It wasn't written for you. It was written 2,000 years ago on the other side of the globe, right? So we can still draw things, draw principles, but we must realize that it wasn't written directly for us. Sometimes we open the Bible and people think, now what is God saying to me? And they read it as if God was writing a letter to that person, right? I think it's a little mistaken. God wasn't writing that to him. There was a person writing that in a specific context. And the third thing is often only one side of the conversation. We're listening into one side of a phone call. So we don't know always what's going on the other side. We can hypothesize by a letter and say, this is probably what they asked or some of the things they were dealing with, but we're only getting one side of the conversation. So when I went through New Testament, they gave us an analogy I thought was helpful. So I want to invite you guys to imagine that you have two kids, two grown adult girls. One of them just completed college, got honors, is now working for the last 6 months, an 80-hour plus a week job, extremely successful, only she's exhausted. And it's beginning to affect her health. Now I want you to imagine your other daughter who's living in your basement. You probably see where this is going already. Living in your basement, right now is unemployed, has had 3 different jobs, part-time jobs within the last 6 months, and is employed right now, goes out on the weekends, hangs out with friends. Now, if you were going to write a letter to each of those people, what would that letter say? Okay? Probably not the same thing. Now, if somebody else was going to read those letters, there might be some discrepancies. It might sound a little different. Like, wow, he sounds really loving and gentle and merciful and calm down and relax and you're working too hard. And the other letter is, get off your butt and go find a job. Get out there. He sounds harsh and almost like, wow, there's no way this could have come from the same person. So that might help us when we're reading the scripture. And we're working through things like faith and works. And some seem to emphasize faith, and some parts seem to emphasize works. And so it might help us to realize that they're addressing often different contexts, and that's okay. And so we're drawing from that. Does that make sense? At the very core, when we're trying to make sense of the New Testament, as Christians, and I have a slide for this, it all comes down to Jesus, right? So Jesus, for Christians, is the definitive revelation of God, which means we always come back to Jesus. What did Jesus teach? How did Jesus live? And I wanted to share this because for some of us, we automatically do this. I think many people do this while reading the Bible, but we think it's just because we're immature and we don't know. But what we'll do is we'll read passages, say the Old Testament, for example, and it's very violent. And God commands this, and God commands that, and we're like, I don't know about that. And then we read Jesus, and we're like, these don't really mesh up. And we don't make sense of that. We're confused. But what do we go to? We go to Jesus, because Jesus stands at the center for Christianity, right? And there is a way of interpreting the Bible called the Christocentric hermeneutic. It's basically a Jesus lens. So I want to encourage you guys, it's okay. None of us knows and can make sense of all the parts of the Bible. Scholars disagree, and they've been studying this stuff for years. And so for us as a community, it's okay to wrestle through things. And ultimately, it's okay to say, I'm not sure what that means, but then I go back to Jesus. Every time I go back to Jesus. And that's not to say I'm going to disengage my mind and I'm not going to think of that. We're going to engage our mind and continue to wrestle with those things, but always come back to Jesus. So you can't talk about the New Testament, obviously, without talking about the greatest command. So follow along with me. Jesus taught us in Matthew 22, where a teacher came up to Jesus and said this, "Teacher, which command of the law is the greatest?" And he said to him, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, all your mind. This is the greatest and the first command. And the second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these 2 commands hang all the law and the prophets." So at the very core for Christianity is this man named Jesus, who summed up everything. If you're going to boil it down and says, to summarize everything, it's love God and love people. And it's interesting, he couldn't separate those. He was asked to give one greatest command, and he said, no, these 2, they're connected. In an essence, you could say, you claim to love God, but if I don't see your love for people, I don't think you have love for God. And if I see love for people, then I think there is something going on inside of you, and there is love for God. So for Christians, it's helpful. In today's context, sometimes, Christianity is known for what? Not always for love. All right? And I have an image, and I'd like to kind of close with this. There's a few images we're going to bring up. And for many people, Christianity is captured in these images. And you could translate them however you want. God hates so-and-so. So-and-so is going to hell. For many people, Christianity is viewed as judgmental and hate-filled. And I'm going to suspect that if you're like me, you've wrestled with this internally as well. almost wanting to distance yourself sometimes. Like, I don't know if I want to be a Christian, because what a lot of people think of when they think of Christianity is hate-filled and judgmental. And something inside of me is saying, I don't know, that's not me. That's not the Jesus that I read in. And yet, people can draw from the Bible like we learned and use the Bible in twisted ways, like a sword, destructive, right? And so I know for many of us we have this, but I wanted to leave us with something different, a different image that we can draw from. When you're tempted to and you're struggling with Christianity, am I a Christian? Or you're struggling with friends that are Christians, or people that you know that are struggling with Christianity, and they have these images floating around in their mind. May we also remember that we're a part of something else that is bringing a lot of good in the world. So the next image I have here, this is William Wilberforce, and he worked in England to abolish the slave trade. 3 days before he died, I believe, they had the, I forget the name of it, but the Abolition of Slave Trade Act. Right? So he see that fulfilled, drawing as a Christian, working against the slavery movement. The next image I have here, Abraham Lincoln. We all know about Abraham Lincoln. None of these people are perfect, by the way. Abraham Lincoln, we all know, is the president of the U.S. during the Civil War, right? Brought our country through that Civil War, again, influenced by the Christian scriptures. The next image I have here is Gandhi. Now, caveat, he never claimed to be a Christian. He was a Hindu. But he did claim to be influenced by the life and teachings of Jesus, especially towards nonviolence and love of others. So that's why I kind of put him up there as well. Next, we have an image. Does anybody know who this is? A few people. Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Dietrich Bonhoeffer was a Lutheran pastor and theologian in Germany in the first half of the 20th century, during the Nazi regime. And he was teaching and traveling and working against the Nazi regime. He got offered a job to come teach at the U.S. He accepted it, came over to the East Coast. And once he got here, something inside of him compelled him to go back to Germany, to go back, put his life in danger. And he said, I just feel like I'm abandoning my people. And I know this is safe, and I know I can do a lot of good here, but something within me is like, this isn't right. So he got on a boat. He went back to Germany. And he continued teaching and influencing people. Eventually, he got arrested. He got charged with conspiracy to assassinate Hitler, and he got hung just days before I think the war ended. Right? Here's another man influenced by the Christian scriptures to bring about greater love and greater justice, practical ways. Next, Rosa Parks is an image of many people, not just her, but she's sort of the symbolic image for many people. When she was on a bus, and during the segregation, she was sitting where the colored section was, and the white section was all filled up, and the bus driver said, I need you to give up your seat, and she refused to do so. Next image, of course, MLK, and we all know stories about MLK, but a Baptist pastor drawing from the New Testament scriptures and the teachings of Jesus to impact the world for greater love and greater justice. Next image, Desmond Tutu. Love Tutu. South African Anglican bishop, Archbishop, I think, of South Africa, worked to end apartheid during the 1980s and the 1990s primarily, influenced again by the Christian scriptures to end apartheid and segregation there as well. And lastly, we have Nelson Mandela, who became eventually the South African president, but spent, I think, 27 years in prison for working against apartheid in South Africa. Again, a Christian influenced by the Christian scriptures, compelled by Jesus, the center of Jesus' message, to love God and love people, and said it's not right and it's not just that people live this way. So as we conclude, there's a lot that we can draw from the New Testament that promotes or seems to promote hatred and judgmentalism. But remember that there is a greater amount of people throughout history that have been influenced by the New Testament to work for amazing causes that brought about more love and more justice, loving God and loving people. I think the world can use more of that. And my hope is that we here as one church community can be a part of that, and we can invite more people to be a part of that. But instead of abandoning religion, as some people want to do, religion's bad, religion's evil, it causes pain, it causes wars, that we can be a part of inviting people and say, but there's so much good that has come out of religion, right? So let's pray.